Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are talking about a scenario that is honestly a bit of a nightmare.
It really is.
You're just running errands. It's a normal day. You park your car, you run into a Sam's Club to grab some things. You come back out. It's not even dark yet, maybe 7:20 p.m. in July. And as you're loading your trunk, someone grabs your ankle from underneath your car.
It's a terrifying set of facts. And it brings us to this huge legal question that's right in the intersection of, business, economics, and just personal safety.
Mm.
When something terrible happens on someone else's property, who is responsible?
Exactly. I mean, the criminal, obviously. But they often vanish or they have no money to compensate you. So the victim, naturally, looks at this huge store, this multi-billion-dollar company, and says, "You invited me here, you should have kept me safe." So today we are diving into Posecai v. Wal-Mart Stores, Inc.
The case that really sets the standard for this.
And it really forces us to look at the idea of duty in negligence law.
Right. And we have a really clear mission today. First, we need to figure out what the threshold is for a business to even have a duty in these cases. Second, we're going to break down the 4 different tests that courts have come up with to decide if a crime was foreseeable.
Which seems to be the key word.
It's everything. Then third, we'll do a really deep dive into the Posecai decision itself and see how the court in Louisiana applied what's called the balancing test. And finally, we'll put it all together into a checklist you can use to spot this on an exam.
Okay, let's start really broad. Generally speaking, does a business have a duty to protect its customers from criminals? Am I my local coffee shop's keeper?
That's a great way to put it. And the short answer, which surprises a lot of people, is no. That's probably the biggest misconception out there. The general rule is that business owners are not insurers of their patrons' safety.
They're not an insurance policy?
No. If they were, they'd be on the hook for absolutely everything bad that happens, regardless of fault.
Which makes sense. I mean, if every corner store owner was liable for every single robbery, a loaf of bread would cost $100 just to cover the legal bill.
Exactly. But, and this is the giant but, in the law, they do have a duty to take reasonable steps to protect patrons from criminal acts when those acts are foreseeable.
That word again, foreseeable. It feels like it's doing all the work here.
It is the entire ballgame.
But isn't everything foreseeable in hindsight? Oh, someone got robbed. I guess we should have foreseen that. It feels a little like a trap.
It is. It's called hindsight bias. And to stop juries from just punishing deep-pocketed businesses because they feel sorry for the victim, courts have developed these 4 different tests over the years to try and define what foreseeable actually means.
Okay, let's walk through them. It seems like an evolution. The first one in our sources is the specific harm rule.
Right. This is the old-school, very restrictive approach. Under the specific harm rule, a business has no duty unless it's aware of a specific imminent harm that's about to happen to a patron.
So unless the manager literally sees a guy with a knife walking toward me in that specific moment.
Essentially, yes. You almost have to be psychic. If they didn't know that Mugger was there at that time targeting you, they're not liable.
That sounds way too restrictive. It lets businesses just ignore a generally dangerous situation.
It does. And it was criticized for exactly that. So the pendulum swung. The second test that came along is the prior similar incidents test.
Okay, so using history as a guide.
Correct. Here, foreseeability is based on evidence of previous crimes on or near the property. If it's happened before, you should have known it could happen again.
That seems more reasonable. If you know you're in a hot spot, you should do something. Is there a downside?
The downside is what some people call the first free crime rule.
The first free crime. That sounds grim.
It is, because under a strict reading of this test, if you're the first person to be attacked in that parking lot, you lose. The store can argue it wasn't foreseeable because there were no prior similar incidents.
So you're the unlucky test case.
You're the sacrificial lamb that puts them on notice for the next person. And it gets messy. How many crimes do you need? 1. 5. How similar is similar? Courts were all over the map.
Okay, I see the problem. So to fix that, some courts went all the way to the other extreme. The third test. The totality of the circumstances test.
Yes, and this is kind of the vibe check of legal tests. It's very common, but it's also very controversial. It looks at everything: the nature of the business, its location, crime in the whole neighborhood.
But that sounds like a sociological trap. If I open a store in a quote-unquote bad neighborhood, am I automatically on the hook just because of my zip code?
That is the #1 criticism. It makes businesses liable just for choosing to operate in a high-crime area.
And if that's the law, businesses will just not open there.
Right. It can create food deserts, job deserts. It punishes the very businesses trying to serve those communities.
Which brings us to number 4, the Goldilocks test, the balancing test. This is the one Louisiana adopted in Posecai.
Yes, California and Tennessee use it too. It tries to find a middle path. It balances the foreseeability and gravity of the harm on one side of the scale against the burden imposed on the business to protect against it on the other.
Risk versus cost.
Exactly.
Okay, this is a great framework. Let's put it to work. Let's analyze Posecai v. Wal-Mart Stores, Inc. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
All right. The plaintiff is Shirley Posecai. The date is July 20, 1995 at 7:20 p.m. And critically, it was still daylight. She leaves the Sam's Club in Kenner, Louisiana, and as she gets to her car, a man who is hiding under it grabs her ankle, points a gun, and demands her jewelry.
And we're talking about a lot of jewelry here.
We are. She had been at a luncheon. She lost a 2.5-carat diamond ring, a diamond and ruby bracelet, a gold watch. All told, it was about $19,000 worth.
A huge loss. What about security? Did Sam's have anyone on duty?
They had one guard, but he was stationed inside the store protecting the cash office. There was no one patrolling the parking lot.
Okay. And in these cases, the plaintiff always brings in an expert to talk about crime stats. What did their expert find?
The expert, David Kent, came in with this huge number at first. He said there were 83 predatory offenses on that same block in the prior 6.5 years.
83. If I'm on the jury and I hear that, I'm thinking, case closed, Sam's Club, write the check.
That's the reaction you want. But, and this is the whole case really, when the court drilled down, they found that on the actual Sam's Club property, there were only 3 incidents in that entire period.
Wow. Okay, that's a massive difference, from 83 down to 3. So given all that, what was the core legal issue?
The sole issue was whether Sam's owed a duty to protect Mrs. Posecai from criminals under the specific facts and circumstances of this case.
And what rule of law did the court apply? Can you state the full black-letter rule and break down its elements?
The court formally adopted the balancing test. The rule has 2 main opposing elements that you have to weigh against each other. The first element is the foreseeability and gravity of the harm, which is mostly about the frequency and similarity of prior crimes.
Okay.
The second element is the burden of the duty on the business, the economic and social cost of requiring security.
Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis. Let's go step by step. How did the court apply that first element, the foreseeability and gravity of the harm?
So the sub-rule here is that the most important factor is the prior incidents on the premises. The court took those 3 incidents and put them under a microscope. Incident 1 from 1989 was a delivery man robbed at 12:45 a.m. while sleeping in his truck behind the store.
Dissimilar.
Totally dissimilar. A customer in the front lot during business hours is a completely different risk than a worker sleeping out back in the middle of the night.
Okay, so strike 1. What was incident 2?
Incident 2 was a purse snatching in 1994. But the police report showed it started as a domestic dispute.
Ah, so not a random attack.
Exactly. The court said a personal conflict that spills over onto the property doesn't really predict random predatory crime against other customers. So they discounted that one too.
The third one?
Incident 3 from 1992 was a mugging in the parking lot. The court said, okay, this one is similar, but it was only one. So the court's conclusion on this first element was that with only one similar crime in 6.5 years amidst a multitude of customers, the foreseeability of this kind of harm was, in their words, slight.
Understood. A single data point isn't a pattern. So now let's look at the other side of the scale. The second element, the burden of the duty.
Right. The sub-rule is that providing security, especially patrols, is a significant monetary expense. The court looked at what Mrs. Posecai was asking for guards in the parking lot. They found that this is a high degree of burden. It's not a one-time cost. It's salaries, insurance, training, management.
A whole operation.
A whole operation. So the conclusion on this element was that the burden is substantial. And to justify such a heavy burden, you would need a very high degree of foreseeability.
And they had already found the foreseeability was slight.
Exactly.
So after analyzing all the elements, what was the court's final conclusion?
The court held that Sam's owed no duty to protect Mrs. Posecai. The slight foreseeability of the crime just did not outweigh the heavy burden of requiring patrols. Therefore, Sam's was not negligent.
That's a really tough outcome for Mrs. Posecai, but I can absolutely see the logic. If they'd ruled the other way, you're basically saying every big box store in a moderately urban area needs a private security force.
That's the implication.
Okay, let's test this rule. I want to use a hypothetical. Let's call it the zombie mall scenario. Same parking lot, but What if, instead of one mugging in 6 years, there'd been a mugging there every Friday night for the last 2 months?
Okay, that completely changes the analysis on the first element. Now you have high frequency and high similarity. The foreseeability is no longer slight, it's high. When you put high foreseeability on the scale opposite the high burden of a guard, the scale tips. A business can't just ignore a weekly pattern of violent crime. Duty would almost certainly exist there.
Right. Now, what about a lesser measure hypothetical? Same facts as the real case, but Mrs. Posecai isn't asking for guards. What if she was robbed in a pitch-black corner of the lot, and all she's arguing is that they had a duty to replace a burnt-out light bulb?
This is a fantastic point, and the court actually talks about this.
Sure.
A lower degree of foreseeability might be enough to trigger a duty to implement lesser measures. The burden of changing a light bulb or trimming a hedge is extremely low.
Pennies, basically.
Right. So because the burden is so low, you don't need a huge dramatic history of crime to make it reasonable. Less evidence is required to force a store to change a light bulb than to force it to hire an army.
That makes the balancing test feel a lot more flexible and sensible. It's not just all or nothing. So for everyone listening, how do we turn this into a system for an exam?
Let's build that diagnostic checklist. When you spot an issue involving a crime by a third party on a business property, here's what you do.
Identify the parties. You need a business owner versus a patron who is an invitee. Step 2, trigger the duty analysis. Write down the general rule. No duty unless the crime was foreseeable. That's your entry point.
Select the test. If the facts point to a jurisdiction like Louisiana or California, you explicitly set up the balancing test. I'd literally draw a scale on my scratch paper.
I like that. Visualize it.
Step 4. Analyze foreseeability. This is where you argue the facts. Look for prior incidents and filter them by recency, frequency, and similarity. And remember the pro tip from Posecai. Discount the stuff that's not really random, like domestic disputes.
Weigh it against the burden, and this is key. You have to ask what the plaintiff is demanding. If they want a guard, that's a high burden, so you need high foreseeability. If they just want better lights, that's a low burden, so you only need lower foreseeability.
That is an incredibly useful framework. It's a flowchart for a really messy area of law. So as we close this out, what's the big picture takeaway? Why did the court come down so hard on the side of the business here?
The big takeaway is that, at least in these jurisdictions, you can't just say it's a high crime area and expect a business to be liable. You need specific, similar on-premises evidence to force their hand, especially for expensive measures like guards.
And there's a deep policy reason for that, isn't there?
There is. The court said it very clearly. They said businesses are not responsible for solving endemic crime that government itself can't fix. They're basically saying that if a neighborhood has a crime problem, that's a societal problem, not a Walmart problem.
And if they forced every business in those areas to hire security,
They'd close, they'd leave, and those communities would be even worse off. The court is making a choice here, and it's prioritizing the economic viability of businesses over the absolute guaranteed safety of every patron.
it's a harsh economic reality, but it's the logic underpinning the law. The business controls the property line, but it doesn't control society. Here's a final thought for you to chew on. We talked about the burden of security being high because hiring people is expensive. But what happens when technology makes security dirt cheap? Think AI cameras that could detect threats, or autonomous drones patrolling a parking lot for pennies an hour. Does that burden element drop so low that eventually businesses will have a duty to watch us everywhere? Something to mull over. Until next time, stay safe and keep diving deep.